Cheers and jeers as the US president unveils his long-awaited Middle East peace plan. Israeli goals get support while Palestinian aspirations are sidelined. Does the proposal boost or undermine peace? What does this say about America's evolving position on the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The last opportunity for peace. That's how US President Donald Trump described his plan to end 7 decades of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. But Palestinian leaders weren't involved in the process and they immediately rejected it. People in the occupied West Bank and Gaza protested as soon as Trump unveiled the proposal with Israel's Prime Minister. It sides with Israel on the so-called final status issues to be resolved with Palestinians. Israel gets all of Jerusalem as its capital, as well as sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank.
My vision presents a win-win opportunity for both sides, a realistic two-state solution that resolves the risk of Palestinian statehood to Israel's security. Today, Israel has taken a giant step toward peace.
I hope that the Palestinians embrace this and build with Israel a future of prosperity and peace. I also hope that our other Arab neighbors embrace your vision and forge a path of reconciliation with Israel that can create for all of us a brilliant future.
Palestinians would get a path towards their own state, but only after 4 years of monitoring to determine whether their leaders are doing enough to fight what is termed as terrorism. And there's no guarantee of their refugees' right to return to ancestral lands. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas called the plan a conspiracy.
In
the announcement, we did not find anything new compared to what we heard 2 years ago. It is sufficient to say that 2 years ago we heard that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel, as claimed by them. We cannot wait and keep on waiting. Our position has not changed, and after we heard this utter nonsense, we say no, no, and a big no to the deal of the century.
Well, let's have a look at how Israel expanded its share of land over the years. More than 90% belonged to the Palestinians during the British Mandate. In 1947, the UN voted to give more than half of the land for a Jewish state and the rest for an Arab one. Well, after declaring a state in 1948 and the war that followed, Israel expanded its control to about 78%. During the 1967 war, Israel occupied the remaining 22%, consisting of the West Bank and Gaza, effectively controlling all of historical Palestine. But in 1993, Israelis and Palestinians signed the Oslo Peace Accord to begin a process of deciding what parts of that 22% would become a Palestinian state. But Israeli policies of settlement expansion and land confiscation have made it difficult for anything to be handed back. The US president is now offering Palestinians only 15% of Mandate Palestine. Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Tel Aviv, Robbie Sable. He's a professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and former legal advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Ramallah, Nabil Shaath, senior Palestinian official and advisor to President Mahmoud Abbas. And in Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and the author of the book, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Phyllis and ask the question, is this a plan that can bring peace, do you think, Phyllis?
I don't think it was designed to bring peace. This was a US-Israeli plan. It was designed as a meeting between the impeached and the indicted, if you will. And its real goal, I think, had far less to do with peace than it does with providing political and legal protection to keep Netanyahu out of jail and Trump in the White House and get them both reelected. So the timing was all about that. The substance of it was to reify and give a U.S. imprimatur, U.S. legitimacy to the existing illegalities that constitute Israeli apartheid, Israeli occupation, violations of the Geneva Conventions, violations of international law, violations of UN resolutions that have characterized the Israeli treatment of Palestinians for these last many, many decades. And I think that what we're looking at is a scenario, much of which we already knew.
If I could, Phyllis, and
Sure.
bring to you the perspective perhaps of the other side, that the narrative goes, hey, this is a realistic plan, and it's the Palestinian leadership has been dreaming, so the narrative goes, of really unrealistic things. Everybody knew that these settlements, Israel is not going to let them go back to Palestinian control. So this isn't about justifying apartheid. This is about creating a state which Palestinians can have their security, but in a more realistic way. What do you say to that narrative?
What I say is that it's only realistic if you accept as real the current levels of violations. This notion that everyone knows, which is what we're constantly told, everyone knows that all the settlement blocks will remain under Israeli control. Everyone knows that Israel will end up controlling all of Jerusalem. Well, the Palestinians don't know that. And international law doesn't say that's okay because the Israelis happen to be more powerful and happen to have the backing of the world's sole superpower. It's not going to work that way. And the notion that this is actually going to be a state for the Palestinians, I think also we have to get rid of that notion. What would exist in 4 years under this plan is very, very far from a state. It's an entity in which Palestinians would have essentially what they have now in what's known as Area A under Oslo in the Palestinian towns and villages. It's essentially municipal authority. They would choose the teachers, they would have the authority to pick up the garbage and issue driver's licenses. They would not be allowed, not only would they have no control over their borders, their airspace, their water, their electronic grid, none of that would be under their own control.
Okay. All right.
And they would not, what's new here is that they would not be allowed even to sign on to international treaties, would not be allowed to use the resources of the United Nations or the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, and crucially that this would be called the end of the conflict.
Okay, Phyllis,
meaning that anyone who
we'll
says
get
this isn't
perhaps
good
into
enough
more
would be an
detail about the sort of the end game, but on this point that we're talking about, let me bring in Robbie and say, Robbie, can you unilaterally give one side all they want pretty much on contentious issues like sovereignty over settlements which are deemed illegal in international law, sovereignty over pretty much all of Jerusalem, no return of Palestinian refugees? Can you give one side all of that and still expect to have peace? Is this really realistic?
Well, I have some reservations about the background you've been describing, but what we want to talk about is the future. Here we have a proposal for a Palestinian independent state with its capital in parts of East Jerusalem. It's not the dream that all the Palestinians have been dreaming about for years. But the tragedy is they've always rejected any compromise. There's no doubt they could have got a better deal for them 70 years ago, 40 years ago. If they reject this, they won't get a better deal in the future. So what they have to do is to sit down and make difficult compromise decisions. So far, unfortunately for us, unfortunately for them, they've failed to do this. And I sense
Robbie,
they're going to do this again.
My question is,
yes,
is there still really room for compromise if you give all, basically, the final status issues, the most contentious issues, to one side? What's left to negotiate over then? What's left to compromise over?
Well, if you look carefully at the plan, there's lots of issues that Israel would not have dreamt of, would not have liked, because it is a compromise. In other words, there will be a Palestinian state according to the plan in the West Bank, which is something the Israeli right wing is not very happy with. They will have the status quo. In other words, there will be connection between Gaza and the West Bank. All sorts of things. Now, it's a plan. It doesn't mean that they have to sign on the dotted line. I don't expect to do. But they have to negotiate. And this is the crux of the issue. They have to sit and realize we're going to have to make compromises, as Israel realizes it had to make compromises. And again, I want to come back to the original point. Their tragedy has been, in the past, they've always rejected any compromise.
Okay, let me bring in...
I'm afraid we're going to see this
Let
again.
me bring in Nabil then. He's Nabil Chaff, of course. You spent a big chunk of your life talking and negotiating. To Robbie's point there, if you reject this, each time the Palestinian side or leadership has rejected a plan, you've ended up with less. Your response to that?
Well, we did accept the Oslo Agreement. We did sign an agreement in the White House. We went through this agreement into several detailed agreements. I ran the Palestinian delegation in the Gaza-Jericho agreement, and we accepted it. We went inside. There was a second agreement that is called Oslo II, which was agreed to. It's not true that we simply will not accept anything. What we want is what international law gives us, what the agreement that we signed in the White House gives us, and the right to an independent state in the area occupied in 1967 by the Israelis, with East Jerusalem, its capital, and the right of refugees guarded by Resolution 194 of the United Nations. These are the terms of reference.
Without now even the support and backing of the US, or is it time, as Robbie would say, to compromise on those issues?
Rabin wanted a peace process, and he was a man of courage and wisdom, and he knew that if there is a real peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, there will be peace between Israel and the whole Arab world. And we were close friends, and really it was a tragedy losing him by an Israeli Jewish extremist who shot and killed him while he was talking about peace in the center of Tel Aviv. But we don't have Mr. Rabin today. We have Mr. Trump and we have Mr. Netanyahu, and the comic show last night really shows the impossibility of these people making a peace process. I mean, if you really were not an American, and you will see that America is trying to play the role of a peacemaker, but brings with it in light and on television the leader of the country that really occupies the Palestinian land and have really tormented the Palestinians in every way possible.
Nabil,
what kind of peace process
let me jump in,
suggesting?
Let me jump in and take this question back to Robbie before I bring in Phyllis, because I can see, I'm sure Phyllis has something to say about this. But Robbie, you said that, look, the Palestinians have to be reasonable and stop rejecting plans, and this plan does give them something Israel doesn't want, a state. Does it really? I mean, when you look at the detail of this, even if the Palestinians accept giving up East Jerusalem, accept giving up the occupied land where the settlements are built, accept giving up the right of return for Palestinian refugees, do they get a state, or do they get 4 years of being under continued occupation while they're in observation until, assumedly at some point, the US and Israel says they think the Palestinians have worked hard enough to fight what they call terrorism? That is not an immediate recognition of Palestinian statehood, even in return for concessions of all of these final status issues, right, Robbie?
It's always an issue of you looking at the glass that is half full or half empty. I agree, this is not what the Palestinians could have got 50 years ago.
But this is more than half empty. This is nothing right now for the Palestinians in return for pretty much everything Israel wanted in the final status issues right now for Israel.
I'm not sure about, because what they're offering, at the moment they have a semi-autonomous Palestinian Authority. It will be recognized, according to the plan, as an independent state. They will have direct access to the Gaza Strip. They will have a capital in East Jerusalem. There's other issues that can be negotiated. And as far as I can see, the plan proposes that the parties sit together and negotiate. It doesn't say you must accept it. It doesn't say that Israel. It doesn't say the Palestinians. So again, I would urge, I agree, Oslo was a success, but the final status talks collapsed because, again, Yasser Arafat, the late Arafat, was not willing to compromise on a very I think generous proposal made at Camp David, and it's a tragedy for the Palestinians. So here is a chance. It may be the last chance. I hope not, but I would suggest them seize the day. It's not what you dreamt about, but sit and negotiate with us. And Israel has proved that when we do negotiate, We can reach agreements. We reach agreement with Egypt. We reach agreement with Jordan. We've reached an initial agreement with the Palestinians.
Let me
We
bring
can do
in
the same
Phyllis.
here.
She's shaking her head, so I'm sure she has something to say about this. Go ahead, Phyllis.
Well, first of all, on the question of negotiations, I think we have to be clear here. This is not a border dispute between Peru and Ecuador that are sitting down together as equals and debating where the border should be drawn. This is an occupied land, an occupied population, and the occupier. When they sit together, they do not sit as equals. So the notion that both sides should make equal compromises, this is simply not it does not reflect reality. This is not reality. What we heard last night from Trump was a direct statement that this plan deals with the security threat to Israel of a Palestinian state. That was how a Palestinian state was viewed. Now, many Palestinians believe, and many people in this country believe, there is no longer the possibility of a Palestinian state. The land has been stolen. The land has been expropriated. There is no longer contiguous land that makes any sense, that is sufficient to be a state. What's called for here, as we spoke of earlier, is not a state that would be independent, that could sign treaties with other countries, that could join international treaties, that has control of its airspace, control of its water. This doesn't have any of that. This is an entity that would remain under Israeli military control. And in that context, I think we have to be very clear that what's on the table is the question of rights, not states. Whether it's one state or two state, red state, blue state, the question of Palestinian rights is what is being denied here. We do not see Palestinian right of return. We do not see the right to live independently and self-determination. We do not see equality for Palestinians living inside Israel who live under this nation-state law that says explicitly they cannot be equal because only Jews have the right to self-determination in the state of Israel. It guarantees under Israel's basic law that Palestinians cannot be equal. So under those circumstances, all of these rights continue to be denied to Palestinians, let alone rights of water, for example, all of which remains on the Israeli side.
Let me bring in the Palestinian perspective and ask the question from this way. Is there any incentive for the Palestinians to continue to negotiate if that's the starting point? It's like, as I said, so much of the final status issues the US would basically give to Israel. Is there much of an incentive for the Palestinians to continue to negotiate in the hope that if they accept all of that, maybe they'd have a sort of quasi-state still under Israeli control in some areas, and it would be 4 years later if the US and Israel are satisfied with the performance of the Palestinian authorities?
You're asking people to negotiate with their captor.
Hang on, sorry, Phyllis. Let me give Nabil a chance to get in on this.
Sure.
I don't see really any real opportunity for peace with this duet of Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu.
So where does that leave you, Nabil? What does that leave the Palestinian alternative, though? Is it, as Robbie, our guest here, would say, really nothing? You're going to go backwards? What is the alternative from the Palestinian perspective?
Look, we are 6.5 million Palestinians in that territory, inside Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza. We are equal to the Jewish population in that area. They cannot throw us in the sea, and we're not really throwing them in the sea. We are under their occupation. To really have a real peace process, there are only two alternatives, no other alternative. Either that the Israelis accept a secular, non-sectarian, one state where Jews, Christians and Muslims have equal rights, the rights to pray and free political will, and a separation of church and state, which the Israelis don't want to. Or else it will be two states on the border of 1967 with East Jerusalem, our capital, and West Jerusalem, their capital, and an agreement of peace between us, allowing us to really have the right to rule that part of the world and to have an opportunity for our refugees to make a choice of whether they want to come back home or go wherever they want to go. Now, this is annulled by this agreement by Mr. Trump and Mr. This is simply, we are not going to have a state. The Israelis are going to take all the land that they have already illegally occupied and turned into colonial settlements. They are going to control the borders between us and Jordan and between us and...
Okay. Okay, I think that point's been made quite clearly. Let me jump in and ask Robbie this question. Do you think this is a plan that can last beyond the Trump administration, Robbie? Because we've seen already a lot of criticism, even from within the US. Senator Warren has been critical of this plan. Joe Biden's come out against it. Bernie Sanders. If things don't go well for the Trump administration in the upcoming elections, Robbie, what do you think the likelihood is that this is a plan that will be discussed or implemented beyond that?
I would say this is not an issue between Israel and the United States. They're not our neighbors. The Palestinians are our neighbors. We don't want to rule over them. It's not in our interest. It's not in the Palestinians' interest. It is in our interest to
But this plan really depends on the unique position of the Trump administration, doesn't it? It's really taken the US position to a new area.
All they can do is help, support a negotiation. Their change from a different position is they accept the reality. The reality is Israeli settlements are there, and this is the reality. The question is, can we proceed from there and reach an agreement? Maybe not. But the agreement must be between us and the Palestinians. We've sat with them in the past. We can sit with them in the future. The United States can sit on the side. It can help. It can kibitz. But basically, it's an issue between us and our neighbors. And it's so important for us Israelis, and I think for the Palestinians, that we do sit together and try and work out some sort of formula, something we needed in the past. Nabil knows this. It's a tragedy we didn't. It's worthwhile trying for this in the future.
Phyllis, there has been a massive evolution in the US public diplomatic position from one in which, during the Oslo days, the US position was, hey, final status issues need to be resolved directly by the two parties in talks, to where we are now, which is basically the Trump administration giving away a lot, if not all, of the final status issues to one side, to the Israeli side. What has caused that massive shift and evolution? Is this the US president pandering to the evangelical religious right in the US?
I spoke to some of the US
and
people.
pandering to the Jewish vote, but particularly to the evangelical Christian right, the Christian Zionist movement, which is a very key part of his political base. What's so ironic here, Sami, is that as you speak of the shift in political discourse, the actual discourse at the popular level and at the media level, and increasingly, slowly in Congress, has been exactly in the other direction, exactly in the direction of outrage at Israeli actions, particularly among young Jews. Organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace that I'm part of, has seen a flood of young Jews and fear among older, more traditional supporters of Israel in the Jewish community who are terrified at losing the youth as they are. And what we're seeing now is that there is a growing chasm between public opinion, particularly in the Democratic Party. This is now a very much partisan issue. Support for Israel is now a Republican issue.
Let me jump in here and give you the counter-narrative to that, Phyllis. There are the supporters of the US president who would say, hey, we've always heard these doomsday scenarios, but look, after the US even recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, it wasn't the end of the world. And that sort of line, which is too melodramatically inaccurate to really take seriously. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's not melodramatic at all. What that's based on is that people didn't see a violent response. And there's the assumption that somehow if there's no blood, if on Israeli side, there's plenty of blood on the Palestinian side every week in Gaza.
All right, let me jump in there. Sorry, Phyllis, we've got a minute left, so I want to try and give Nabil a final thought to come in. And how concerned are you that between now and November, for example, whatever happens in the upcoming elections, Israel will work very hard to make sure any US recognition it gets for its position will be irreversible. And you're not getting the support of the Arab governments in the way that you used to get in the past.
There is nothing irreversible in the United States. It's a democratic country. And if there are elections after even if Mr. Trump was re-elected, in 5 years things are going to change in the United States. In 5 years things are going to change in the world. Really, we're closer to the end of a monopolar world, into a world in which Russia, China, Europe become really equal in importance and in influence. And therefore, Mr. Trump is not our fate. and he is not going to be there forever. And therefore, things can change. There's nothing irreversible about this. If you really want peace in the Middle East, and peace is important to the United States as it is to us and to the Israelis, what has been proposed does not bring peace.
We're going to have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests very much for joining this discussion, Robbie, Nabil and Phyllis. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.